It's often disregarded as the weakest of our fingers, the one that kind of hangs off the side while the others are doing all the work. But in fact, your pinky is the secret to not only making your guitar chords sound gorgeous, it's also one of the easiest and most interesting ways of coming up with new melodies when writing songs. And if you're a songwriter who primarily writes on guitar and you have some basic chords and scales under the fingers, but you're feeling frustrated by using the same sounds and the same shapes over and over again, this video is for you. And what I'm really going to focus on in this video is taking basic chords and transforming them into beautiful chords with bounce and movement and melody sprinkled throughout them, all by engaging this little finger. So let's dive in and start transforming some chords in open position. There are roughly 9 chords that we learn in open position on guitar, and we use these chords a lot in our songwriting. And because we use these chords so much, we really want to start here and see if we can add some movement and a little excitement to some of these more static chord shapes. So the 9 chords I want to focus on here are C major, A minor, A major, F major, D major, D minor, G major, E major, and E minor. And one thing I really want to draw your attention to straight away is that with all of these chord forms, the little finger is not being used. And not only is it not being used, it's actually in a perfect position to start adding some melodic material on top of these chords. So you can see with this C chord, the little finger is just hovering there above these strings waiting to be used. And if we drop it down on the B string, we get a C add 9. We can move it across to the top string and bring the 5th of that chord into play. We can also drop it down on the 3rd string and create a C dominant chord. So you can see that without really moving the hand at all, the little finger is ready to drop down on those 3 strings and add some of those notes to the chord. And what's really exciting as a songwriter is when we can start bringing melodies and chords together in the one motion. And later on in the video, I actually want to show you how this process can even inform lyrics when you're writing a new song. But right now, let's just look at how we can create a little melody on top of this C chord. 3, 4, and... Let's move on to the A minor chord, and you'll see that the little finger again is there ready to go. If we go to the A major, we can do the same thing. And that sound there really gives us the sound of an A dominant. If we move on to the F chord, again, the little finger is in perfect position. If we move on to the D chord, D minor, G, E major, and E minor. So with all of these chords, you can see the little finger is really in a great position to drop down and start adding some movement to these chords. The challenge with this is that we actually have to practice. We actually have to strengthen the little finger by using it and not just letting it hang off the side. And using the little finger in this way requires us to get comfortable with a couple of techniques, and those are called hammer-ons and pull-offs. Hammer-ons are where we drop the finger down without re-picking the string. So that's a hammer-on. A pull-off is where we do the opposite. We kind of snap the finger off the side of the string and lift it up. One of the ways this technique can really help you out of a rut is it forces your hand to explore different positions. If we take the G chord, for example, it's probably the one with the least amount of movement available. We can move that little finger up and down, and it's a really great sound, but there's so much more we can do if we just pivot our hand slightly and play a G chord like this with the open strings. Now we have the little finger down here available for this kind of sound. And while we're in this position, we can then look at playing some of the other chords different ways. So for example, the C chord we would normally play here with the third finger on the root. But while we're here in this position playing the G chord, what if we moved our second finger across to play the C like this? So if you've always been playing a C chord like this and the G chord like this, moving your hand slightly into this position and getting access to these other fingers and looking for these melodic opportunities may be the thing that inspires a whole new song and a whole new way of playing these chords. And I've created a free PDF showing these chord forms with the little finger variations added. So if you're interested, you'll find the link below. Now, one of the best ways to start using this technique as a songwriter is to look for little 3-chord combos where you can place the same melody on top of each chord, or at least a little modified version of this melody. And this is really creating like a little motif that we can then move around the different chords. So if we take the chord progression C, A minor, F, C as an example. Without any vamps, the chord progression could sound like this. It's a beautiful sound, and sometimes that's all we want. We don't always want the chords to be busy and have lots of melodic movement on top of them. But if we are looking for something a little different, if we are looking to create some movement and transform these static chords, let's look what happens if we start putting a little motif on top. And for me, when I'm writing songs, I find this process so stimulating because the chords on their own have lots of potential. When we start adding a melody to them, it really feels like it takes the song in a certain direction. It gives it momentum, and it just makes it more interesting for me to start trying to attach then some lyrical ideas to those melodies. What if we were to do this with a bluesy kind of song? Again, looking for a motif that sits on top. We'll do a blues in the key of E. And that means we're going to introduce a B7 chord. Now that's a lot of movement, and the little finger's working pretty hard there, but the sound is so great that it's really worth developing and practicing or making part of your songwriting routine. We don't have to be moving chords around like that for this to be a really effective technique. And if you just think about the beginning of the Queen classic Crazy Little Thing Called Love, that is a D major chord with the little finger dropping down to create that sus sound. Just that one little finger vamp was enough to transform a static D major chord into one of the most iconic intros of all time. And so this is really the point I'm trying to make. We have available to us this finger that is so often underused or ignored, but it's in a perfect position, it's waiting to be used. We just need to look for opportunities to incorporate it into our songwriting. Now, as we move away from open position chords, I'm going to show you some other really beautiful ways to incorporate the little finger. And one of those ways is when we're using triads on the top 3 strings. So if we take that D major chord and lay out the triads in the key of D, we get D major, E minor, F sharp minor, G major, A major, B minor, C sharp diminished, and back to D. And again, you'll notice that the little finger is there, not being used, but ready to add an extra note to each of these triads. And we rarely use the whole run of triads like that, but what we do a lot is take 2 or 3 of those little chords and use them in a sequence. One of my absolute favorite sounds on guitar is playing double stops or 2 adjacent strings simultaneously. And when we're writing melodies, we're usually thinking one note at a time. But if you're going to start writing melodies on guitar, you have an opportunity to engage this double stop technique and change the nature of that melody. For example, imagine we're writing in the key of A minor and we're setting up this groove, and the melody is this. Now that melody sounds solid, it sounds catchy, it's funky. It's a melody that I would want to start writing lyrics to. But the other thing we can do as guitarists is actually play these double stops and change the way the melody sounds. We're going to take it from this to this. And you can hear how interesting that suddenly sounds. And this not only serves to create some really great sounding riffs and motifs, it can often change the way you think about the melody writing process when you're coming up with a new song. And the little finger there is playing such an important role because we could play this without the little finger, but it creates some issues. For example, I could do it like this. By flattening this 3rd finger. The problem with that is I lose accuracy. I'm sort of just flattening the finger and trying to get the sound to be clean. The other problem is that I'm using the fleshy part of my finger and that changes the tone. It makes the tone dull. It's not a great sound. The little finger coming in underneath gives us a cleaner sound, more accuracy, and using the tip of the finger also keeps it consistent with the other fingers. Finally, let's talk about bar chords. Bar chords can create an interesting challenge for the hand because we're often trying to get this finger to go across the whole neck, and it creates a fair bit of stress or strain in certain positions. So it doesn't always feel like there's much we can do with a bar chord, but in fact, if we can take this little finger away from this position and bring it over to the top strings, we again have the option of putting melodies on top. So if we look at an A minor bar chord, the little finger can do this. What about if we take a D major 7? With the dominant 9 chord, the little finger is there to add the 13 on top, and this is great for funk and blues. The last thing I want to say is I think we often keep our melody writing and our chord writing and our lyric writing far too separate. What's really exciting about bringing them all together is that they start informing each other, they start influencing each other. And this is when songwriting can feel really vibrant and connected. And something that happened just yesterday was I was playing around with this technique, playing around with a D major 7 shape, and I came up with this. And for some reason, a little lyrical phrase popped into my head, and that line was, "Why do I always? Why do I always?" And as soon as I said that, the second thought was, well, what do I always do? What is something that I always do? And something that I always do is forget people's names. I've got a really bad memory for names. And so it made sense to go, why do I always forget your name? And before that moment, I had no intention of writing a song about forgetting people's names. It wasn't on my radar. But something about that melody brought that lyrical idea into existence right in that moment. And so then I had a lyrical idea to work with. And I also had a theme. I had a mood. I had somewhere to take this idea. What often happens is we come up with lots of little melodic ideas or little chord moves that sound really pretty, but are just little fragments. And so they sit there unused, forgotten, and they start piling up. But if we can find an opportunity early in the piece to bring together lyrics and chords and melody, it helps create this momentum that allows us to finish more of our songs. Why do I always forget your name? Try to remember, it's always the same. It's always the same. It's always the same. So regardless of where you are on the neck or what kind of form you're playing, the little finger is always there, it's always available, and it can really be the difference between a chord progression or a song that's sounding a little static and one that has movement and bounce and excitement all the way through it. Happy songwriting. Bye.